increase the likelihood that a large financial firm with assets of between $100 billion and $250 billion would fail.
SVB was known as a tech lender and held more than $200 billion in assets.
Independent Senator Bernie Sanders has been proven right once again as the second biggest bank failure in U.S. history just occurred. That is the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. This is the biggest bank collapse since Washington Mutual failed in 2008. So in this video, I will get to how Bernie was right. I'll get to what happened in this case. I'll get to what the government is currently saying about this. And I'll also get to what Biden is saying, which I find a little interesting. But first here, so this is what happened. This from the Lever News. On Friday, California regulators shut down the Silicon Valley Bank, a top lender to venture capital firms and tech startups, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation took it over, following a bank run by its customers. The bank reportedly did not have a chief risk officer in the months leading up to the collapse, while more than 90% of its deposits were not insured. So, I will get to the government response. Is it going to be a taxpayer-funded bailout? But first here, this is why this happened. From Common Dreams. In 2018, ignoring the vocal warnings of experts and advocacy groups, the then Republican-controlled Congress passed legislation that weakened post-financial crisis regulations for banks between $50 billion and $250 billion in assets, sparking fears of systemically risky failures and more taxpayer bailouts. Silicon Valley Bank, the California-based firm that collapsed on Friday, controlled an estimated $212 billion, leading analysts and lawmakers to argue that the 2018 law made the institution's market-rattling failure and resulting federal takeover more likely. And guess who was saying this back in 2018 before this passed, arguing against passing this further deregulation of Wall Street? Of course, as I said, Bernie Sanders. So as Jordan Ewell shared here, in 2018, Congress, and after intense lobbying by the financial sector, pushed to further deregulate the banking industry. Sanders opposed it, citing the CBO, which issued a report finding further deregulation increased the likelihood a bank like SVB would fail. Check this out.
Are our memories so short that we have learned nothing from the 2008 Wall Street crash? 15 million families, as a result of that financial crisis, lost their homes to foreclosure as more and more people could not afford to pay their mortgages. As a result of the illegal behavior of Wall Street, American households lost over $13 trillion in savings. That is what Wall Street did 10 years ago. And against my strong opposition then, Congress and the Federal Reserve provided the largest taxpayer bailout in the history of the world to these huge banks because they were too big to fail. But now, 10 years later, hoping that we forget all about that, these large financial institutions are back again. How pathetic is that? Just yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office told us that the legislation we are debating today will, and I quote, increase the likelihood that a large financial firm with assets of between $100 billion and $250 billion would fail, end of quote.
And that's exactly what happened. There's Bernie back in 2018 warning this would happen, and it happened. At the end of this video, I'm going to link to one of my videos from a few years ago showcasing Bernie Sanders over the years on all major positions and him being correct on every single position. It may appear like I'm a little annoyed right now because I am. Watching how both the press and Bernie's Democrats, well, I mean, he's not a Democrat, but people that he caucuses with, watching them attempt to smear him both in 2016 and again in 2020 when he was running for president was so incredibly frustrating when it was clear this is the man that should be in power. It is so rare to have a politician like this be correct again and again, whether it's on the Iraq War, whether it's on media consolidation, whether it's on corporate power, whether it's on gay rights, whether it's on Wall Street. Go down the list, every single issue, he has been proven correct. Yet, of course, he is not the controlling voice in Washington. No, you have corporate control, so people like Bernie Sanders are drowned out. Let me get to his statement and, of course, the reaction from the White House and what their response is to all this. But as Bernie writes, my statement on Silicon Valley Bank, he put this out this weekend, saying, let's be clear, the failure of Silicon Valley Bank is a direct result of an absurd 2018 bank deregulation bill signed by Trump that I strongly opposed. 5 years ago, the Republican director of the Congressional Budget Office released a report finding that this legislation would increase the likelihood that a large financial firm with assets between $100 billion and $250 billion would fail. Then he goes on to quote himself from the video I just showed you. And he also goes on to say, now is not the time for U.S. taxpayers to bail out Silicon Valley Bank. If there is a bailout of Silicon Valley Bank, it must be 100% financed by Wall Street and large financial institutions. So I'll get to what they're currently saying in a second here. But on this 2018 bill that was passed, of course, before it, the bank industry spent, or I should say the bank, SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, spent more than $500,000 on federal lobbying, which in the grand scheme of things isn't even a lot, but it's enough to buy off politicians, and they got what they wanted. So it's important to point out here, as David Sirota tweets out, quick reminder, 50 Republican senators and 17 Democratic senators voted to ignore warnings and weaken risk regulations for Silicon Valley Bank. Donald Trump signed the bill into law, and it is now the second biggest bank collapse in American history. So if you want to see if your senator's on this list, this is the full list. I'll link to this below the video under sources on YouTube as well. But, in terms of Democrats, it's the ones you would expect. It's the more conservative, more corporate Democrats, including both Democrats from Delaware, Biden's home state, which is not surprising considering Delaware is Wall Street's biggest friend. But just to give you an idea of, the positions that a lot of these Democrats hold when it comes to these economic issues, there's not much of a difference between them and Republicans. So 17 was enough to push this through. Now, Warren Gunnels, who of course works with Bernie Sanders, says here the vulture capitalists who call canceling student debt a dangerous socialist experiment are now begging for a bailout for Silicon Valley Bank after spending millions lobbying to deregulate it. Dr. King was right. We have socialism for the rich, rugged capitalism for the rest. So yes, of course, they are calling for a massive taxpayer-funded bailout. Now, will they get it? Well, first here, in a statement on Sunday ahead of the government's rescue plan announcement, Matt Stoller, research director for the American Economic Liberties Project, made the case against any taxpayer bailout for Silicon Valley Bank. Silicon Valley Bank was a badly managed and corrupt institution that entangled itself with powerful actors in the tech industry. The operative question government regulators are now facing is whether to use taxpayer funds to bail out the depositors from the failures of SVB's management. But a full bailout, Stoller warned, will only encourage other regional banks to take similar risks in the future, just as Silicon Valley Bank did. And this goes to, when Bernie talks about how we can't have banks that are too big to fail, this is what he's talking about. Where there is no, failure isn't an option for them. And a lot of them realize that. So they're able to take these sorts of risks, knowing that if they collapse, well, it's okay because, as usual, the government's going to come to their rescue. Now, in this case, it's a bit of a mix. So Janet Yellen here is ruling out bailout for Silicon Valley Bank, saying we're not doing that again, talking about how we're not going to go back to what we did in 2008. So the specifics on that, here from the AP, in an effort to shore up confidence in the banking system, the Treasury Department, Federal Reserve, and FDIC said Sunday that all Silicon Valley Bank clients would be protected. The clients would be protected and able to access their money. They also announced steps that are intended to protect the bank's customers and prevent additional bank runs. Though Sunday's steps marked the most extensive government intervention in the banking system since the 2008 financial crisis, its actions are relatively limited compared with what was done 15 years ago. The two failed banks themselves have not been rescued, and taxpayer money has not been provided to the banks. So far, it's sounding like they are doing what Bernie's asking, but it's really early. We're going to have to wait and ensure that taxpayer money is not going to bail out this bank. But so far, it looks like they're taking care of the customers, not taking care of the banks themselves. Now, again, just going to the point that I mentioned earlier, some expert observers were quick to voice concern that SVB's collapse is just the start of broader chaos in the financial industry and the overall economy. So this is what they do every single time. Oh, you have to bail us out, because if you don't, well, we're all going to collapse. But then why do you argue against regulations? They do that because it's in their personal financial interest to do that. So they personally can make as much money as possible. And then again, they know if it all collapses on them, well, it's fine because we'll be bailed out. So this is the the circle of Wall Street that happens, every decade or so. Now, to Biden. Biden vows to hold those responsible for Silicon Valley Bank failure fully accountable. First, when it comes to the, executives, I will believe it when I see it. Biden is not one to hold people in Wall Street accountable. But even apart from that, you'd also have to hold your own senators accountable, including your two home state senators that voted in favor of deregulating the bank industry once again in 2018. So how are you going to hold them responsible? You're not, I'm sure he's attempting to refer to those that ran the bank, but you can't simply ignore the lawmakers that were bought off by this bank, by the industry, to do this. There has to be a real honest discussion from leadership about having some sort of barriers when it comes to doing what is best for people and opposing what is best for massive corporations and billionaires. Now, that discussion is not going to happen from leadership because this is how they operate. Of course, it's also, we have to be clear, every single Republican also voted for this. It's not just Democrats. But to have, Biden come out as the Democratic president and claim that he's going to hold these people accountable when 17 Democratic senators voted in favor of this, come on. You're not going to see anyone there in terms of Democratic senators held accountable. Now, I'm going to link to this below the video. This is Biden versus Bernie, who's on the correct side of history. I put this video out a few years ago. And, because it was the Democratic primary, Biden is the other comparison there. But Biden is simply a representation of most Democrats at the time. So you're going to have Bernie Sanders being correct on everything. And then you're going to have Biden being wrong about everything. So check out that video. It's one of my favorite videos that I've done. A 20-minute breakdown comparing the two, because it really goes to just how much of an outlier Bernie is in Washington in terms of not even just how correct he is, but in terms of who he stands for, the working class, and what politicians in Washington, who they typically stand for. So it is I think, a good breakdown showcasing that divide. So I will link to that below the video. But yeah, once again, Bernie Sanders, proven right.